All right, perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started. Try and keep on track for time. Brian and I both like to talk in general and like to talk about AAPs. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. We will have time at the end for questions. So anybody that has questions, absolutely feel free to raise them at the end. Send them into the chat if you would like, and we will address them. Just for information purposes, we are recording the session today. So if you do have a question that you'd rather not ask in a public setting, we will make ourselves available via email, phone call outside of the meeting today, if you'd rather address the question offline. So with that, good afternoon. Thanks for setting aside a little bit of time in your day to join myself and Brian Ayers as we walk through several areas of how to successfully design your affirmative action plans. I believe I've had the opportunity to speak with most of you on the phone here today, but for those I haven't, my name's Matt Rossler. I'm a senior member consultant here at MEA. I joined right at the end of August 2020, and my role involves being a first point of contact for our members on any projects or consulting needs that they may have, which includes affirmative action plans. So since joining MEA at the end of 2020, Brian and I have had the opportunity to work on about 12 or 15 affirmative action plans together, in addition to just having some conversations with members and non-members around specific areas of AAP development and need. And that's really what kind of kicked off the idea for today's webinar, today's discussion, particularly around that first year considerations when it comes to designing an AAP, and we'll get into that. But that's why we thought it was good to jump on a call, and I'm glad to see we have some really good participation of both members and non-members. So that's a little bit about me and why we're doing the call today. And Brian, with that, I'll ask if you want to give a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll get going.
Sure. So my name is Brian Ayers. I'm the managing attorney for affirmative action planning services with Employers Council. And we're similar to MEA in that we're also a membership association out in the western part of the country, from basically Colorado West. And then we're based out of Denver, but also are within Arizona and Utah. I oversee our affirmative action planning services team. And so we've got a team of specialists as well as myself and another attorney on the team. And we put together affirmative action plans for members, both inside and outside the organization. And so we work with really a wide variety. We've got some very large members who have undergone audits regularly, because the agency that oversees this will audit everyone, but certainly will sometimes target larger organizations. We've also got much smaller organizations that we'll prepare for. And we in particular do work with a number of members who are coming to this for the first time, putting a plan together for the first time. And so we're I think, pretty well versed in what you really need to be worried about, and then kind of what the common concerns are when you're really setting out to set the foundation for this. Perfect.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll say I know enough about AAPs, and Brian will probably confirm this to be dangerous. But Brian's going to do the majority of the talking today, and he's really truly the expert in this space, and as I said, a really trusted advisor to our members and MEA in general. So glad to have him joining us. So in terms of what we'll be talking about today, we'll start out with the laws that govern AAPs and who's required to comply, kind of that first level, make sure that it is even something that you have to participate in. We'll look at each of the component parts of an affirmative action plan and the various data that's required for each of those parts. As I mentioned at the beginning, we'll talk about first year AAP considerations. There's often a lot of anxiety around the first year AAP development, so we'll spend a little bit of time there. Also talk about considerations for how best to track and manage all of the required data. So we'll talk about the data points from a candidate perspective, from a employee perspective, from a census perspective, and how best to keep track of all of that and make sure that every year when you are developing your AAP, it's not a cumbersome process. And then we'll talk about what it looks like after that first year. So once we've got that first year down and that plan is developed, what it looks like to continue developing your AAPs going forward. So Brian, if we start with the basics, like I said, give us an idea of what triggers an employer as needing to have an AAP, a written AAP.
So there's a few different areas this comes from, but the common baseline you'll see kind of across the board is that if you have at least 50 employees, And that's 50 employees across the board. It doesn't have to be necessarily 50 in the location working on the federal contract or 50 actually working on the federal contract. But if you have 50 across your workforce and you are working on a federal contract worth at least 50,000, typically speaking, that's going to have to be one actual contract hitting that threshold. It's rare that you would actually aggregate contracts together to get that. Really, it's more when you're in kind of an ongoing supplier relationship that might come up. But typically, if you are supplying $50,000 worth of goods or services, either directly to a federal government agency as a federal contractor or to another federal contractor to further their work on the contract, and so as a subcontractor, either of those will be enough to require a written affirmative action plan. The subcontractor eligibility is probably what's more common, just because most projects are going to have one top line contractor and then a number of subs involved. That's also probably where it's trickier, because if you're a top line contractor, you know you're doing business with the federal government typically. It's being aware that the private enterprise we're doing business with is themselves a federal contractor, and so that carries obligations for us. I think that's probably where, if there's difficulty here in realizing your obligation, that's usually where that's going to come from. And then as Matt has here, while it's more of kind of an ingrained analysis for other organizations, you're looking at the actual contract itself, you're trying to figure out the nature of it, is it going to qualify for this? It's much simpler for financial institutions. If you are a bank or a credit union that has deposit insurance, that essentially is going to be enough. If you're a bank that is a part of FDIC, if you're a credit union that's a part of NCUA, and you have at least 50 employees, that's considered a federal contract, that deposit insurance.
Got it. And just to kind of drive the point home, this isn't like a benefits thing where it's, FTE, full-time equivalent or anything like that. It's, as we have here on the screen, part-time, seasonal employees, everybody's included in that 50 employee count, right?
Yes. Yep. Even as far as if you've got like military employees on leave of absence, but they're still technically in the workforce, when they come back, they're included towards that count.
Okay. And with the seasonal employee count, if we're talking retail, for example, right? So we've got 30 employees during the majority of the year, but towards the end of the year, holiday season, we spike up to 60. What's the time limit, I guess? Is it just a point in time if you cross that threshold, or?
It's a little bit harder there than with some of the reports that are tied to that. One, with seasonal, when you're trying to figure out, are they still counting on our workforce long term? One of the things to look at is basically, are they being rehired? Are they having to go through a new hiring process, or is it once they want to come back, they're back? Because if that's the case, they're going to be viewed as a more permanent part of your workforce and go towards that number that's larger. With the fluctuating workforce, we would typically advise that you put a plan together, but this is enforced by an agency of the Department of Labor, and they enforce through audits. And so in theory, if they were to audit, you would come back and say, basically, we're below the jurisdictional threshold. We don't have 50 employees at that point. Most likely, though, if you were above 50 at a point in the federal contract, that's going to be enough to carry the obligation.
Got it. Okay. Are there any instances where somebody who doesn't fall into one of the 3 bullet points that we have here on the screen, where they would still want to voluntarily decide to develop an AAP?
Yeah, we're seeing more organizations want to do it almost as a means of kind of monitoring their diversity and their representation within the community. And so I think that that's a perfectly legitimate use of this. I think it's a good use of this. It's just important to, if you're going to do that, I think to understand how an affirmative action plan should be used, and in particular to understand the risks that come with that. The most common misconception we see in this area is the idea that affirmative action plans means quotas, that we're going to look at particular areas and say, okay, you've got a shortfall of women in this area, you've got a shortfall of African-American employees in this area, and so your next few hires in that area need to be targeted in that. It doesn't mean that, and that sort of activity would be problematic in an audit. Affirmative action is all geared around the idea of good faith efforts to target and recruit qualified applicants from areas that you've identified as underserved. But then to still, once you're actually at the point of making decisions, of selecting and going through your normal hiring process, you're still doing it in a race blind, gender blind. You're hiring the most qualified person regardless of demographics.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and I know, one of the things we've seen here at MEA is particularly related to diversity, equity, inclusion is, whether it's a government contract or not, RFPs are starting to request, diversity data and diversity initiatives. So yeah, I get what you're saying there in terms of some organizations kind of looking to an AAP as a way of managing that.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot more of that, I think, the last 2 or 3 years in particular, that there just has been more interest around. We'd like to get an idea of how do we compare to the community, and if we're not comparing well, what can we do to improve that?
Yep, got it. And you and I have both been on calls with CEOs, CFOs, and sometimes HR leaders who argue that their EEO ADA policy is sufficient, right? Or that maybe they have a state certification. So I know recently we had a member send over a certification from the state of New Jersey, and they said, oh, we're good. We don't have to do a federal AAP because we've got a really solid EEO policy, ADA policy. I guess first question there is, what are the risks of not having an AAP if you're otherwise required to?
That really is, there's a lot of specific components that have to be a part of an affirmative action plan. So I agree, we see a lot of people will call things affirmative action plans, but they really are not, as far as the government is concerned, an actual AAP. And so it's just, I think, important for us to realize there's a lot of different components that are required, particularly some different statistical tests, and then actions that you're taking that are tied to what are we finding in the statistical analysis. So an EEO policy is typically going to be insufficient for that, because a lot of what the government is looking for at that stage is, are you doing the work to look at your workforce, and then how are you responding to what you're finding? So one, I think that's a large risk of that. I'm sorry, I had a train of thought and I just lost it. What was the second half of your question?
Yeah, what are the risks of not having one? So you get audited and you say, hey, here's our policy, we're good. Federal government is going to say what?
In an audit, it really is, you'll get a letter and you'll have 30 days to respond with the required materials. And it's your AAP as well as some kind of supporting documentation and statistics. If you have your AAP ready, that changes really the whole course of it. They will grant automatically, actually, basically an extension for the supporting materials, as well as just the way the auditor views you. The course of the audit is going to be more collaborative almost. You're going to be on a better footing with the auditor. The other side of that is when you don't have the AAP itself ready, they won't grant anything as far as an extension goes, and it's going to be night and day in terms of the auditor's approach. They're going to assume the worst basically at every stage at that point. Having an AAP versus not having an AAP is everything really in an audit. I think you can have a flawed AAP and come away okay, or come away with just maybe some manageable correctives in terms of actions that you'll take down the line, but coming away without an AAP, one, you're likely going to come out of that with some pain. The other risk that comes with that is those statistical tests that they require. Those are where in an audit, they can look for indicators of discrimination. And then that's more serious, because it's not just we're going to require corrective action on your part, but we're going to potentially gather plaintiffs and maybe file suit or try to negotiate a settlement. When looking at those, part of the reason you run the analyses to look at the activity in those areas because it's required, but you also do it so that you can get a preview of where are vulnerabilities here. When the audit comes, what is the auditor going to focus on? And let's make sure we have explanations ready that we can investigate and figure out what happened here and basically put our best foot forward. By not doing an AAP, you're going in blind on those. And so they're very likely going to, the federal government is going to run their own tests in that instance, and they're going to come in with questions, and they're going to come in with areas that they already consider problematic, and you're basically going to be coming in blind and having to answer on the spot.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So, and I flipped to the second screen here because you kind of bled right into it, which is great. As opposed to a policy, or as opposed to a state certification, an AAP does have all of these specific parts that we see here on the screen, right? And all of the data that goes into that. There's a ton of statistical analysis that I know you and your team do based on the data that's sent over. So talk a little bit about the types of statistical results that we're looking for, and what those areas of analysis are.
Yeah, there's almost an AAP is kind of split into two parts, where you're looking back at your activity, at your workforce over the past year, and you're doing these statistical analyses. And then based on what you're seeing, you're crafting a narrative for here's what we're going to do for the coming year. Any areas where we're seeing we need work or we need some sort of additional action, this is what we're going to do. But these statistical reports as a result are really the foundational element of the whole AAP. And so with these, we're breaking down into a look at your workforce, first of all. We're going to take a snapshot of your workforce on one particular day where we'll look at the demographics, we'll look at the pay, and in particular, we're going to compare it to what the census data tells us about your surrounding community. That availability analysis is, you get to basically decide what is the community that you're pulling from. We're going to break your workforce down into different job groups that are basically similarly situated employees. Things like your administrative type positions will be together, your skilled labor positions will be together, your semi-skilled positions, et cetera. Within each of those groups, then you'll give an indication of, we report when we're recruiting, what are the areas that we're pulling from here. And that can be kind of as fine or as broad as you would like. It can be, we recruit from the entire state of Pennsylvania, or you can break it down to it's 5% Bucks County, 5% Chester County, 5% Erie, and kind of all over the place there. But the idea is you're getting to indicate this is the community that we recruit from, and so this is the community that we should be held to. You're then comparing your workforce to that community, basically, and coming up with, there's a few different measures that they allow, but some sort of measure that says any comparison where we're falling below this threshold, we're going to view as something that we need to address, and we're going to set a placement goal in this area. And that's really what the crux of affirmative action is. It's the idea that over time, your workforce should resemble the surrounding community that you're recruiting from, and where it doesn't, it's taking action to, in the long term, help it to reach that goal. And so that's where placement goals are set. What that means is that you're going to try to recruit qualified applicants in those areas. The hard part of that is, again, how to do that without running afoul of what I talked about with quotas. And so I always say that I think it makes sense to draw a dividing line between building the applicant pool and then what you do with the applicant pool. The idea of affirmative action is, if we're having a shortfall in, say, African-American employees within this particular job group, we need to be more visible. We need to take action to recruit, to get more applicants from that community. And then it's trusting that if we have a race-blind, gender-blind hiring process, if we're following EEO principles, if we're seeing more qualified applicants from these groups over time, that'll show up in more employees in the workforce. And so that's why so much of this is around good faith, is around incremental progress. It's not requiring necessarily, we've identified a problem this year, it needs to be fixed the following year. It's an understanding that most of these things are going to take time and good faith effort.
So moving into the first year considerations, and the third bullet point there, identification of the appropriate applicant pool. So you just gave us the background on that and what that all means. But I'm curious, particularly now, right, with COVID and with much more of a remote workforce, are you seeing, and maybe it hasn't happened yet, but maybe next year, are you seeing many of your members kind of broaden their applicant pool and say, okay, well, we used to pull from the Philadelphia and surrounding counties, but now, hey, we'll hire anywhere in the country, right? Are they changing their data to account for that?
We're definitely seeing a change in practice there, and that's a good question about. I think we're going to see basically this year as we start to get more of that availability data of whether it makes sense then to start to. And I know precisely what you're talking about. I'm interviewing somebody from my team tomorrow from Arkansas, where before the pandemic, I don't think that I would have necessarily looked at that. But at this point, with everyone remote, there's no reason not to. The real question then becomes, should you change your eligibility? I think the question around really changing your availability is this going to be more of a permanent practice, or is it a temporary outgrowth of this? Typically, your availability is more, this is our long-term, this is our general practice in this area. You don't necessarily want to fluctuate it that much year to year. And okay, last year we recruited more in this particular county, but this year I think we're going to recruit more. It's more kind of over a 5-year, over a 10-year period, where are we typically looking here? So that I think is where that question goes, is this temporary, or is it more of a permanent switch?
Got it. Okay. And, again, I know as you and I are talking with our members who are just having to develop AAPs, whether they just cross the threshold of employee count, or they're getting ready to bid on a government contract, there is significant anxiety around the things that we see here on the screen, right? So Again, just talked about the appropriate applicant pool, but if we take them in order, identification of the reporting year. I mean, is this always a January to December look back, or can it be any identified reporting?
It really can be any identified. Yep, 12-month period. And so we have a lot of members, or a lot that we work with, that will do a calendar year, and I don't have any issue with that. I'll often advise to think about, given that it can be any 12-month period, and that you're going to be pulling then the information the same time year after year, think about basically what you as an HR staff have kind of going on and when it's a good and bad time of year. We'll have some who are doing, if you have a busy end of year, if that happens to be maybe when open enrollment is, or just if there are other activities going on, then it may be a lot to ask of you to also be pulling AAP information on an annual basis at that time. And so in that case, we do have members who will do something like a March 1st through February 28th, or April 1st through March 31st, something like that. As long as it's a 12-month period, you're perfectly fine to pick whatever is most convenient for you there.
Got it. Okay. I mean, the other thing that, go ahead.
Oh, we'll sometimes have two questions there around actually, I think this probably ties into the next bullet point too, but we got a new ATS halfway through the year. We maybe started tracking this part of the year, but we definitely didn't have it the whole year. One, there's nothing wrong in that instance with structuring your plan year around when are we going to have the most data. I also would say, though, we work with a lot of first-time members who are preparing a plan for the first time. And so the good news there is we're very comfortable with kind of the setting that foundation and educating from the ground up. What I find is that I've described in audits that good faith efforts and the incremental progress are so important, and really establishing a rapport with the auditor is important too. I think that it almost in an odd way is advantageous to have kind of some weaknesses in the plan the first year, as long as you don't get audited that first year, because it's easier then to show progress as you start to implement it. It's an easy case to make to an auditor of, we may not have known we had this obligation previously, or it might be a brand new obligation, but you can see that as soon as we learned about what we had to do, the action that we've taken, and you can see that we're taking this seriously. A lot of times it's, in an audit, it's as important that you're just trying to establish this as our company culture, that there's a culture of compliance as much as the actual kind of nuts and bolts of what you're reporting. Part of the reason I say that is there's really two categories of things that they'll look for. That there's indicators of discrimination, which are what I talked about with the some of those other reports that they can gather a class of plaintiffs and they can potentially negotiate a settlement. Most of the things that they deal with, though, don't fall into that category. They'll fall into what's called technical violations, and they don't actually have the power to fine for technical violations. So the agency that oversees this is really concerned more with getting you doing the correct thing, and with if there's something that you shouldn't be doing, with getting you to the point where you are doing it. And so where they're finding violations, they're then concerned typically with making sure that they'll give specific correctives of it. If you haven't, say, been reporting this, that you need to make sure that you report it, and then we're going to monitor it extra maybe for the next 2 years. We're going to have you send it to us. All that is to say, if you've had kind of weaknesses in that early year where maybe you weren't tracking things or there weren't policies in place, but then over that first year you've implemented, you've got these up to par, often as not, even if they find it in an audit, if they could see that you've corrected it by now and you're doing the correct thing, they're not going to have that level of concern, because the only thing they tell you is to do what you're already doing, basically.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things, right? So often we say, okay, well, we're going to need, we're going to need gender, we're going to need race, we're going to need veteran status for all of your candidates, and we get this wide-eyed look that goes, well, I didn't track any of that, right? And I hear you say that, okay, that the first year AAP is going to be essentially a 1-to-1 ratio, right? One candidate to one employee. And that's where I think, as you kind of alluded to, the narrative that you all develop in conjunction with the member, that's the biggest part of a first year AAP, right? Because it in some ways justifies that, right? Hey, it's our first year. Am I right on that?
Yeah, and the narrative won't necessarily, I mean, that's also something we kind of established with the auditor in the actual audit. But yeah, exactly. It's going to look, that's what they're mostly going to be concerned about too, is what are you actually doing then? What are you implementing, and what are the actions that, with limited information, what are you starting with? And then are you actually doing what you say you're going to do? And that's a lot of what they'll get concerned with. Are you doing what you say you're going to do? And then afterwards, are you looking back to see, was this effective? Should we continue, or should we go in a different direction?
Okay. And how much, I mean, the last bullet point there, management education, right? So how much how much do you suggest that your members do educate their managers, right? Particularly hiring managers. You might have a hiring manager that if this is the first year, they've gone to the same candidate pool. Everybody that they've ever pulled has been a referral. Or everybody that they've ever pulled come through Indeed. But now we have to broaden that pool. How much education, how much discussion do you advise members have with their hiring team in particular?
I do think that's important. I think your hiring managers are really going to be your front line in terms of carrying out the plan, and what they're doing day to day is going to have the biggest impact on your actual plan, what it looks like. There also there's a number of requirements, of course, within the regulations, but one of them is that your staff who has duties basically relevant to the AAP is trained on those. We actually include training on the AAP responsibilities with the plan. And so what we'll do there is we do target it towards hiring managers. It's the way we like to do it is the first half will be more, here's what affirmative action is in general, here's why it applies to you as an organization, and then some basics about what you have to do. The second half is much more about their actual, how it impacts them and what they can do in their day-to-day that impacts the plan. There's a lot around how applicants are treated, how applicants are coded, that just has a huge impact. And so we spend a long time on, I think, understanding kind of where the applicant definition comes and how that can impact things. Just we've seen that have a big impact. I do think I highly recommend that.
Okay, same thing, and we'll talk on the next screen. Same thing around the ideas of promotions, terminations, transfers.
Yeah, they hires are the biggest of those, but your activity over the previous year, your hires, your promotions and transfers, your terminations, there's a statistical analysis of those as well, where we basically would look at the pool of who you're selecting from, who are the other applicants, or who else is in the same positions that are eligible for promotion, who else was in the same job group that got terminated. And then we look to see if any selection rates are disproportionate, if anybody's being adversely impacted by that. Those are what the federal government, that's what they'll use as indicators of discrimination. So we'll look closely at that. But because of that, it makes sense to the rules around who is an applicant, around what gets coded and what gets looked at as a promotion, as a termination are important. So we want to make sure, that your staff understands that.
Got it. And one of the things you touched on there that we don't have on the screen here that I probably should have put up is almost similar to here in this region, a pandemic safety officer, right? Somebody is identified as having ownership of the AAP and the AAP process, and somebody at the organization actually signs the AAP, correct?
And those actually are two different people usually. There is somebody who's designated as responsible as the point person, and they're typically, if you're audited, that's who the notification will come to, and then you'll be the primary point of communication with the auditing agency. Separately, your highest U.S. official, typically it's your CEO, but whoever your highest official is, signs, there's an EEO policy statement within the plan that basically says this is our approach to it. It's an indication, the theory behind it is it indicates to employees and the applicants that this isn't just on a piece of paper, but it's got management support behind it, that we're all on board with this.
Yeah, great. So if we move on to the actual tracking and managing of the data, again, you're never going to hear me say that Excel is my friend, mainly because I don't like numbers, I don't like data. I'll spend more time on the the column headings and the cell colors than anything else. But I do understand that Excel is our friend in this case, right? We've got a master Excel worksheet that we work with our members to collect data on. Going back to my original days when I first started in HR, I started at a bank, right? So as you said, when we started this presentation, we were required to have an AAP. Smaller community banks. So we did everything via Excel. I was tracking candidates. I was tracking transfers, promotions, all via master Excel spreadsheet. But I think more and more, a lot of the, even the base level HCM platforms, payroll platforms have the capability of tracking, a number of the things that we see here on the screen. Maybe not necessarily candidate data. That's going to be, an applicant tracking system. But talk quickly, and you alluded to it before, if a member has or a non-member has an applicant tracking system, right? I like it because it aggregates all of your different posting sites. So again, hopefully you're posting to a broad number of sites, diversity sites and otherwise. Everything funnels into one central location. But you mentioned disposition codes before, kind of, why a candidate's maybe chosen, not chosen, passed over, whatever it might be. Talk about the importance of a disposition code and the reasons you're using.
Yeah, we do quite a bit with disposition codes. And actually, in the event that I keep talking about audits just because we will approach everything kind of through the lens of if you are audited, making sure that everything is appropriate, it's compliant, that it's going to pass basically with the notice of compliance. I just lost my train of thought again. I'm sorry. Applicant tracking, I'm sorry, disposition codes, what to cover. With disposition codes, when we do get an audit, that's actually what we'll spend the most time on, is looking at the applicants, looking at how they're coded, and looking at basically who should be counted and who should not. When I mentioned that when the OFCCP is the government agency that oversees this, when they find what they consider an indicator of discrimination, they can then, again, gather a class of plaintiffs. They can either negotiate a settlement or can have a lawsuit filed. When they do that, they will also look at hires the closest, because that's where the highest dollar amounts by far for them come. With terminations, with promotions, if they're filing a discrimination suit around that, you have a limited universe basically of who the plaintiffs might be. It's going to be just your existing employees who are in the affected demographic group who would have been eligible for or who were wrongly terminated. Hires are a little bit of a different animal, because the universe of potential plaintiffs is much larger. It's your broader applicant pool of everybody who applied for the job. What helps here is there's a specific definition around what an applicant is and is not. And it uses a number, there's 4 different categories, but there's a few things such as the candidate must meet your minimum qualifications in order to count as an applicant. If you establish this is what our expression of interest must look like, it has to include these materials when you apply, and you consistently enforce that, anyone who doesn't submit everything, who doesn't have everything there, can be eliminated. And there's a few others like that. Anyone who does not meet that criteria, who doesn't meet the definition there for applicant, isn't eligible to be part of a settlement, isn't eligible as a plaintiff. Everybody that you can rule out as an applicant, you're shrinking the universe of, if there are indicators of discrimination found, you've shrank the universe of what the potential financial liability is going to look like at that point. The other factor there is the more that you weed out really candidates who shouldn't be counted as applicants, you get a more accurate statistical analysis. When you have kind of extras included there who maybe shouldn't be, that with proper disposition codes we could eliminate, you tend to get false positives that pop up. You may get adverse impact indicated when it's more just a function of the numbers are weird, basically. We've got way more applicants who weren't good candidates. They don't meet the basic qualifications. They were never true candidates to get hired for the position. They're just throwing our numbers off. And so disposition codes are how we do all of that. Those are how we'll apply that rule and how we'll decide who's in and who's out. It's also how the auditor will do that in the event you get to that stage. And so accurate disposition codes are everything. And so we will go over that with members. That's something that in that training I mentioned, I'll focus heavily on that applicant definition and on the fact that basically if you have someone who was eliminated for a reason that disqualifies them as an applicant, it's crucial that we capture that in the codes, basically. The other reason you want to make sure that you've got good data here and got good codes is that there's a requirement that I've alluded to this a bit too, but that you basically monitor the effectiveness of your plan from year to year, that you evaluate your outreach, and that if you're seeing areas where it's not getting what you wanted to do done, you're trying something different. The OFCCP isn't going to punish you at all for, we've tried this and it didn't work, but they are going to come down harder if this isn't working, but we're just rolling the same thing out year after year without really looking at should we change anything up. All that is to say, what I always worry about is if you're either not getting good disposition codes, or if you're not capturing applicants, if you're just not having enough people self-identify, you may be accomplishing what you're looking to. You've reached out to these communities, you're more visible, you actually are getting more applicants from the area, and you're doing what you were hoping with your placement goals, but you're not able actually to capture the success or to prove the success because you don't have the self-IDs, you don't have the raw data to prove what you've been doing. And so that's the other thing I worry about here is just, there's a lot of times proper capturing of applicants and of applicant data is what allows you to actually demonstrate your compliance and your success.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions I had for you, Brian, is, it is a voluntary EEO self-identification, right? So voluntary starts off the name of the form. What happens if you do have candidates or internal employees that say, yeah, I'm not filling it out, right?
That's the hard thing is especially for candidates, if they're not employees at all, they basically are just going to show up as unknown. You're not allowed to. There's a tool you're required to use for employees they'll call visual identification, which is you're using your best guess in that case. It's uncomfortable. It's certainly, there aren't many I talk to who actually like doing it, but the good news there is the OFCCP is aware it's uncomfortable. I've never seen them come back and say, why did you guess this race instead of this race? You're taking your best guess and you're making a good faith effort there. With applicants, though, you're not allowed to do that. And so any applicant who ends up opting out or who just skips the question winds up showing up as unknown. And then that's where I talk about the risk of you may be getting applicants from the communities you're targeting and just don't have a way to capture that. It's tricky because you have to give them an opportunity to opt out. And so, you don't want to step on that. You don't want to do it in a way where they're feeling coerced of, okay, I can opt out, but it's going to be held against me. The OFCCP, where they see, it'll show up for them in that hires to applicants report, because it'll look like the only identification we have is for the person we hired. We don't have ID for any applicants, but either the employee self-identified or we use visual identification because it's an employee. And so it looks like a 1-to-1 ratio. That is a red flag for them, but it's a red flag in a specific way. What they'll do is they'll inquire basically into how do you administer your self-IDs, how do you distribute them. Ultimately, if you're giving them out at the proper time, if your communications around them are what they're supposed to be, they're going to be fine. There's nothing you can do about the fact that if people have the right to opt out, they can exercise that. One thing I have seen be effective in maybe increasing numbers a bit there, if you have electronic applications, we had someone who everything was a drop-down question. And so some of them were mandatory where you couldn't hit next to go to the next page, but some of them were not. They made the self-identification mandatory where it had not been before. You still had the opt-out option within there, and that was prominently featured but what was happening was they were getting almost soft opt-outs of, if this question isn't mandatory, I'm not even going to look closely at it. Whereas once it's, okay, I've got to pick something to move to the next page, you maybe have people who didn't necessarily care about opting out who now start self-identifying because they've got to pick something. That's not problematic from the OFCCP standpoint because you're still offering the opt-out, but you've just practically made it kind of, it's no longer the path of least resistance to opt out. I've seen that be effective. I also think that's the sort of thing that if that member were audited, I would hold that up to the auditor as an example of the different efforts that we're taking to improve the quality of the AAP.
Got it. And I just want to be cognizant of time here. So we do have one other slide, but I want to make one more point for this particular one. We also have a couple of questions that came through that I want to make sure we get to. But on the transfers, promotions, terminations, right? Old adage holds true here, right? Garbage in, garbage out. If you're not making good use of your HCM platform, if you're not putting in the EEO codes for job titles, so when we talk about promotions and transfers, right, what we're looking at is feeder pools. So if you're promoting into a professional, EEOC code 2 level, where are they coming from, right? So what are the feeder pools for those? So all of that can be tracked generally within a good HCM payroll platform. So if you're not making use of that now and you're doing everything via Excel, probably a fairly simple transition into tracking a lot of that in your current system. So maybe something for those of you on the call to look at, but I'll leave that there so we can get to the next page here, which is, the subsequent year plan development. And we talked a little bit about this, Brian, in terms of, so we've got our first year down, we've got our fifth year down, how do we keep it fresh, right? What do we keep looking at? What do we change, if anything? Do we need to change anything? So I'll pose that question first, and then I've got one more for you.
And that really is, I think, the hard part. What do you do year to year? And it might be easy initially to come up, not easy, but yeah, actually, the OFCCP has put out basically a list of, these are some of the recruitment activities that we anticipate contractors may do. And so that first couple of years, it's easy to just pull from that list. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel if the agency who oversees it is giving you the answer key. What's hard, though, is that they want to see basically that you're monitoring this and you're checking on what's working and what's not, and then where you're finding things that aren't working, that you're going in a different direction. And so, yeah, your year 5, your year 6 plan is typically not going to look like your year 1, because one of two things is going to have happened. Either you actually are hitting what you're hoping you do, and maybe the placement goals have gone away over time because 5 years is maybe more realistic than 1, or you aren't having maybe the success in the particular groups that you were hoping to reach. And so you've changed it up and you're doing different recruiting things. one thing that we can help there with is we, about a year ago, actually brought on a former OFCCP auditor to our staff. And so he's been just an invaluable resource in a number of ways. Where actually, though, I had initially thought the biggest help he's going to be to members is to guiding them through audits. And we are, I think, very good at that. But he's actually been the biggest help to members in creative recruiting ideas. He's just got a wealth of information from his time there of here's what I've seen other organizations do and what I've seen work. And also, here's what I know when other organizations and audits have held up as this is what we're trying, what's impressed us, and then what has not, basically. And so that is a thing that we'll also offer along with the plan is then as you're looking at basically how do we implement this or what else should we be doing, Tom is his name, that we have Tom available to help as well with kind of creativity around what other direction should we go in here because we're striking out right now.
Got it. Perfect. And the other question I had for you regarding, subsequent years is, we've been developing an AAP for 2 years, 3 years, 15 years, and then, all of a sudden we drop below 50 employees for the year, or, we don't get a government contract that year, but we're expecting that we're going to go back over 50 and that we're going to keep bidding for government contracts. Do we skip that year? Do we keep going through that year?
We have a mix probably of that. And I think more tend to keep going, but technically if your contract's expired and there's another one down the line, but there isn't one right now, the jurisdiction, the requirement only applies as long as you actually are in that government contract. So you could drop and come back, and we do have some that will do that. We'll have others that basically say it fluctuates enough that we want consistency year to year. It's too hard to kind of figure out year to year. Are we eligible this year? And we also, I do think there's an advantage too with having the consistency of plans to be able to look at kind of how it develops. And it's easier sometimes to paint that picture of good faith efforts as opposed to with the start stop, you're almost always in that first year. The first year is tougher because you're building from the ground up. What helps is just kind of the timing of how the OFCCP does audits. It's rare if you have a first year plan that's the one that's going to get selected. Even if you find yourself on the audit list, knock on wood, but chances are by the time they come around and are actually calling for the plan, you're going to be in the next year and you're able to show the one that has some improvement. But I think that's the risk of the on-off is that you're always looking like a first year plan.
Got it. Okay. So we'll move on to questions. I do have 2 in the chat box. If there are other questions that anybody on the line with us has, by all means, feel free to send them in. I always do like to give credit where credit is due, and it's a perfect example of why we partner with Brian. There were several questions throughout that presentation that Brian and I did not talk about, that I did not send to Brian in advance. So I kind of threw at him in the moment here, and you can tell the expertise there because he rolled right through them with no problem. And again, that's why I enjoy our calls so much, because we can throw stuff like that at you, and you definitely have the answers. So in that vein, I have 2 questions here that came in, Brian, on the question of disability data. So the question is, we have our new employees self-identify for race, but we don't currently ask about veteran status, although we know who those individuals are, or specific disabilities. Should we add that to the new hire process?
Yes.
The concern there is asking about disabilities seems fraught with danger regarding ADA issues, which, I get, but does the risk outweigh,
Well, and with disability, there's actually a very specific form. There's specific forms that the OFCC provides for all of these, for race and gender, for veterans, for disability. They're a little weird about the disability one. You can change the other ones kind of as you need. With disability, they're strict about it's got to be used as we provide it. And I think part of the reason for that is they'll give a definition of disability and then examples of possible ones on there. And I think that they don't want that being changed too much. There's also the element of you're only asked to self-identify as disabled, yes or no, but not anything specific about the disability. And I imagine that that's part of the reason that they really limit what you do with the form is that they're worried about the danger basically of it morphing into that. It's supposed to be more of just a straight yes or no, and then you're using it for identification purposes. But for instance, it shouldn't be a situation, somebody shouldn't, you can't stop whatever they identify, but it shouldn't be asked in a way where they're being asked to identify a specific disability, because that almost potentially is going to start a different interactive process.
Perfect. Okay. And the second question that we have is regarding, the internet applicant rule, and you touched on this a bit. At what point does an applicant become an applicant, right? So for example, if we use Indeed and we're lucky enough to get an influx of candidates, are all of those candidates an applicant, or are they only counted as an applicant when they are moved to the first step of the hiring process, which might be a phone screen?
So the four requirements are: one, the expression of interest must match what you as the hirer are requiring. Two is that the contractor actually reviews the candidate, some element of the candidacy, and gives some evaluation, basically decides that we're going to move them on, do they meet the minimum qualifications. So that likely would be, sometimes with Indeed, especially if you're getting maybe like 5,000 applications and you're deciding, okay, we're going to look at the first 50 and then see if we get from there, and then we'll move to the next 50 if we don't. In that instance, the first 50 would qualify for that second prong, but the other 4,500 or 4,950, I'm sorry, wouldn't, because you haven't reviewed anything with their candidacy. So that, I think, will likely a lot of the times kind of weed out. But it's have they submitted the expression properly? Have you actually reviewed their candidacy? Did they meet the minimum qualifications? The fourth one's kind of broader. We'll usually refer to it as willingness. It's kind of a combination of, have they withdrawn from consideration, and are they willing basically to take the job under the parameters you're offering it.
And one of the things around kind of online postings, at least that I've heard, Brian, is to put an expiration date on it, right, to limit that applicant pool. So, rather than having that evergreen posting that's up there and you're just constantly collecting applicants, put a 30, 60, 90-day expiration on that requisition. Is that true?
Yeah, I do think that's a good idea. It's also good because then it's better. Requisition numbers can be as important as disposition codes, because you want as much as possible to tie applicants to a specific position. The data starts to get thrown off when applicants have to be duplicated basically into multiple applicant pools or multiple groups. And that's the risk you run sometimes as disposition codes, as requisition numbers gets blurred. Particularly in there, we will often specifically advise not to accept when you get almost like an unsolicited or general application for any open position, that it should be, the application needs to be for a specific requisition or for a specific opening. The reason for that is the courts have ruled if you do accept any open position, then that application needs to be applied to any other opening you have within a reasonable amount of time, which would probably be the next few months. So what will often happen is the applicant then gets duplicated into multiple pools as a result. And then typically, maybe not always, but oftentimes your best candidates typically aren't coming through that pool anyway. So it's more likely kind of a weaker applicant is being duplicated as opposed to somebody stronger.
Very good. So that was the last question that I have that came through the chat. I'll give it a quick 5 count here if anybody does have any other questions, but otherwise we will wrap up there if nothing else comes through. Oh, and here we go. I was on 4, so you squeaked this one in. We've got a question about what about if an employee referred candidate?
That can be hardest, I think, with that expression of interest, because you'll get the, okay, we're setting a protocol of everyone has to create send a resume and a cover letter, or everybody has to create a candidate profile on the website. And then you get the referral, who's often who is really the strongest candidate or is kind of the one coming in. And they maybe just email or they don't do everything. It's appropriate then to reach out and basically say, we're happy to hear from you. We'd love to consider you. We need you to go through this avenue in order to do that. And then that's how you preserve that, because the rule with the internet applicant rule is that you have to be consistent with those. If you're making exceptions to let people buy, then that's basically you can't use that then to weed people out. It's gonna let everybody buy. So another aspect of that I was gonna touch on. Oh, just that the other side of that is I think that no problem with hiring a referral, but as much as possible, you still want them to actually go through the hiring process. One, you're likely going to be required under the other regulations to post the job with the state workforce board as part of those veteran requirements. And then that's one where, as that shows up in the hires versus applicants report, you want it to look like the other hires. If that's a 1-to-1 ratio where it wasn't posted and we just hired a referral, that's where potentially you're going to have an auditor say, well, you're supposed to be doing outreach in these areas, why not here? And that's where it's potentially trouble.
How about and this is a great question, it kind of gets back to the promotions and transfers, and it's a question that I had, but I, in the interest of time, didn't ask it, so I appreciate you asking the question on the line here. For internal postings, do internal, employees have to go through the same applicant process? And if you have that volume of candidates, does that play into some of the analysis and the reporting?
No, if it's a purely internal and it's existing employees, it would likely be looked at differently. But there really wouldn't be, I think, the same kind of it wouldn't show up in the hires. It would show up in the promotions and transfers at that point. The way that those get worked is promotions for this purpose are defined as movement from one job group to another in an upward manner. The job groups they're similar to those EEO categories, like Matt said earlier. And so if you're moving from the more entry level ones around 8 or 9 up to just the higher positions, 2, 3, 4, that's going to be viewed as a promotion. If you've got, though, you may have positions that you internally view as a promotion, but if they're within the same job group, it won't show up on a report.
Yeah, perfect. So I think we'll leave it there. If there are any other questions, I will send out the recording from today once we've got it rendered and cleaned up a bit. So everyone will have my contact information. By all means, please feel free to send those questions over. Brian and I will be sure to address them. But again, appreciate you spending the time with us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.